Fantastic. Right, I make it 3 here in the UK, so I think it's time to kick off. Welcome to our third webinar in our series, How to Master Your CRM Data in 2025, where today we're going to be looking at 3 proven ways to reduce the storage costs within Dynamics 365, which is very relevant at this moment in time. So we'll be covering off a few tips and tricks on how to achieve that. Before we start, we have 2 other webinars that we've done this year, one around the trends and predictions for data in 2025, and then the 5 levels of customer data management. So if you missed those, they're on our YouTube channel, and you can see those. We might put a link in the chat. Feel free to ask any questions as we go along, and we'll pick those up at the end. I would love to hear from you guys. And right, let's crack on. So what are we going to look at today? Well, we're going to start off the first area is how to analyze and identify redundant data within D365. First, we've got to understand where we've got to look. Otherwise, we're going to be shooting at the dark. So we'll have some tips and tricks on how to achieve that. Step 2, we're going to dig into a bit of the weeds. We're going to look at 3 strategies to safely remove historic data, and 3 ways hopefully you can take away and will apply to your business. And then 3, we're going to look at a case study on one specific use case, and then some takeaway tips and tricks of what to do and what not to do, learn from experience. So just quickly, if you haven't heard of us, my name's Conor Doyle. I work for DQ Global, and we help organizations who are fed up when it comes to managing the data within CRM, specifically around the Microsoft space. Fantastic partners around building the container. We are all about the content. So just to give a little bit of context about us. So as I mentioned, the first area is how to analyze and understand what redundant data we have in the system. Now, before we do that, we need to look at the 3 different areas how data is stored in D365. So in order to do that, we need to look at those 3 areas. You may have heard of these terms, and I will show you how you can find these numbers out. But we're going to start with number 1, which is the most costly storage medium, is Dataverse storage, and I'll explain what this is in a moment, at $40 per gigabyte per month. So really quite expensive if you're storing things that you don't need to store. We then have the second medium, which is file storage. So think of this more like SharePoint, but stored within your Dynamics 365 tenant, and that is $2 per gigabyte. We then have log storage, which is audit history and some other storage types, which we'll speak about later, and that's at $10 per gigabyte per month. So first, we've got to understand the cost implications with these different types of storage. You might be wondering, well, how do I even find out about this stuff? So what am I storing in my tenant? And actually, how we can do that is we can access storage here in the admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com, and that's a link that's just about to go into the chat. So Harry can put that in, and maybe you can follow this journey as we go through the webinar or see the recording afterwards. It is quite straightforward. So what we do is we go to environment within our admin center. We select the environment we're going to work with. We select the resources we're working with, and we look at capacity. And when you get to that screen, what you will see is something like this, where you'll have listed out your database storage and how much of it's being used and how much of it is available, your file storage, and your log storage. And here's an example at the bottom there. On the right-hand side, you then have a listing of your database log and file storage, and the top row there is showing you what you have as default within your tenant when you purchase your license. And on top of that, every user you purchase, you get additional storage. So you can see there, the user licenses row. We then have additional storage, which we might have purchased. And this is where we're getting that inflated storage cost. So we need to be conscious of what we're purchasing and how we might be able to bring that down. So that's step number 1. We're going to look at what we're storing in the database and what capacity we have. So how do we then assess that storage? Well, we're going to dig into a little bit more in the analytics, and we're going to go into Dataverse specifically. And in there we have, let me share these screenshots. We have the environment that you're going to work with. Then you're going to look at the details. So that's circled there in the middle of the screen. And once you pop that, you'll get taken to a screen that looks familiar here, where you're going to get the breakdown of each individual table and the storage within that table. A lot of people, well, it's common that people don't know this, but actually on the right-hand side, there's three lines there. It's like a burger symbol. And if you click that, you can actually download all of your tables into an Excel file, and it will give you the storage per table. And again, we're going to drill into that even further in a moment. So how are we going to then start to identify the problem areas now we have the data, the storage against those tables? Well, in order to do that, we need to find what we're labeling the offending tables, the tables that have bloated in storage, and that can come in all different shapes and sizes. And what that looks like when you get the Excel export, you're going to have the table name, and then you're going to have the database size in megabytes. So you can see there the lead base, the lead records in this environment, is taking up 1.2 gigabytes of storage. And we're going to go down and you can list all of those different storage types. We then need to start to understand those tables. So we just mentioned there about lead base, that is the records in the lead table. You've got post base, which is to do with the timeline association. You have different types of tables. So you have relevant search there. So all of you might be, all of you probably be familiar with relevant search at the top of your Dynamics instance. This is all to do with indexing of records when you're searching for them. So the 650 megabytes taken up purely for indexing for searching purposes. We have a plugin assembly, which is all to do with plugin storage within your instance. We have attributes, which is metadata. We have annotations, which are notes. And then we have other types, which you may see in there, which you might try and rattle your head around. Things like localized label. Localized label is where you hover over a field and you can actually see the label pop up. And again, it's metadata. Typically, we see large amounts of storage in activity pointers or activity parties. And what they are is to do with if you have an email will regard a contact or another table. And then that email itself will have a to, who it's being emailed to, who it's from, who is the owner. And again, all of those pointers to different tables will take up a lot of storage. And we were working with a client recently where they have 150 gigabytes in that activity pointer table. So it really can bloat. And what we need to do is be able to understand those tables to understand how we might actually start tackling the challenges of those tables in terms of storage. And again, there's loads of information on the Microsoft Docs websites, and we can send that out in a subsequent mail. So we have the storage per table. We understand the tables now. What we now need to do is understand these tables are Dataverse tables. They're $40 per gigabyte. And we need to sum the storage costs. So we're going to multiply gigabytes by the storage per month, cost per month. And then we're going to get out what that table is actually costing us per year. And it can be quite big at times. Again, simple calculation you can do in Excel. We're then going to go back to the slide before where we saw what we had as default storage, user storage, and then what we were paying as additional storage. And that's effectively our line as to where we want to get to. We don't need to get to zero storage. We already have some capacity in the system. We just need to be able to bring it within an area where we're not paying for additional capacity. And once we've done that, we need to dig into the table. So let's say we have accounts or contacts in the database. We might have 1 million contacts. Well, can I actually reduce the data in that table? Can I remove any contacts? So then let's look at the step of actually drilling into the data within those tables. And that's going to be our next step around building data retention rules. And this is all about understanding the data in the system. So if we look here about the data lifecycle management, from data creation, we create a record through multiple different ways. We store that data, we use that data, we interact with the data. We then say, oh, We might not need it. We might not need it so readily. So let's archive it. Let's put it somewhere, an Excel sheet, a SQL database, somewhere else that might be cheaper and less accessible, until the point where ultimately it needs to be destroyed. And I think a lot of the reason why people have joined the call is that process never happens, especially the archive nor the data destruction, because we're hoarding that data. So how do we start to build data retention rules? Well, there's two aspects to that. First one is around business questions or business criteria. And you really need to ask the people who are interacting with the data. Does this data provide business value? Yes or no? And really push back at how has it been interacted with, and try and surface out stats like, in the last 24 months, only 10% of our records have been interacted with in some way, shape, or form. Therefore, how can you argue that point? So really try and serve up the facts as to whether that data is providing business value. You'll often have to go to a legal or compliance team to say, does the data need to be kept because it's their patient records, or because of GDPR compliance, or because of legislation within different regions. So there is a question around whether it needs to be stored and where it needs to be stored. Does it need to be accessed by users? So could it go in cold storage? Could it take 10 minutes to be accessed, or does it need to be readily available within a UI, within an application? So again, some business questions to be asking back from the IT division back to sales, marketing, or the business. So then we have here technical criteria. Again, are we looking at time-based criteria? We haven't contacted these people, we haven't called them, we haven't emailed them, we haven't done anything with them for 5 years. Therefore, they've fallen into a retention. And is that rolling? Can we get the stats out in order to support that business case? Is there a lack of quality in that data? As in, the email doesn't exist. There is no telephone, there's no contact method. Potentially the email doesn't deliver anymore. So could we build up a combination of that criteria in order to build up a retention rule that then rolls through the database as records fall into that criteria? Once you've done that, once you've got the technical criteria and the business criteria built, you then got to convert that into queries that you're going to look at in the database. So how many records fall into that criteria? And a suggestion here is around using something like XRM Toolbox, which has a great add-in called SQL for CDS, where you can write SQL queries in order to get the data and counts and slice and dice the data to understand it better and present that back to the business for sign-off. And there it is. You've got to get this. You've got to get this signed off by the business. Typically this falls into the IT camp. We're doing all the hard work. We're getting all the analytics, presenting that back to the business, and then the business needs to make the decision on that data. So make sure that we're serving up the correct facts. So we've done a great job now at scoping, understanding the data we have in terms of storage, what it is, what we will be able to get rid of. What are the 3 techniques we can now use in order to get rid of or move or shrink that data? And we're going to look at 3 methods here. The 3 reduction methods that we're going to look at is data deletion. It's fairly straightforward. Now we have our rules defined. Data archiving, a little bit more complicated. It does prove great power in moving data to a cheaper storage method. And then data compression, which has recently come about. And I'll talk about that. So looking specifically at Dataverse, where we have $40 per gigabyte per month costs, what can we do? So we have the rules signed off by the business that says this data hasn't been contacted in 4 years, blah, 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 blah. You've built up the criteria. Great. So we're going to run the queries to identify the counts of records that we can issue a delete statement for. We need to sense check the results. Okay, it's so easy to make a mistake, but do look through those results before you actually execute the delete in the database. Make sure you approve project sign-off is a no-brainer. And I would always recommend that we unit test in Sandbox or UAT on a single record to understand some critical factors. And those critical factors are, do we have cascade delete rules on? So if I delete a contact, will it go and delete other records within the system that are related to that contact? We need to be looking at the time it takes to delete records, especially when we're talking about large volumes. We could look at multi-threading to increase the speed at which the deletion runs if the system's not at full capacity. And a critical tip in this deletion process that really helps get IT to get buy-in from the business is say, we will deactivate these records prior to deletion for X period of time. And if the business comes screaming to reactivate the records, you can do that within a couple of minutes. Deletion is going to be a very painful process. So that would be my biggest tip in this method in order to try and keep the process moving forward. Okay, so we've performed some deletions from some data that definitely didn't need to be in the system. However, we do have data that has to be kept because of compliance, because users need to access the data, but we don't want to pay $40 per gigabyte per month for that storage. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to look to archive the data. So let's run through that method. We have criteria for data deletion. We have criteria that where data can go into colder storage. So signed off that criteria, the business is happy. And the second step we're going to take is to replicate that data to SQL Server, which is costing about 50p per gigabyte per month rather than £32 per gigabyte per month. So that's a 64 times saving on the storage. From there, we need to surface that data from SQL that's being rolled into an archive. So we can use a method around virtual tables that can be supported in Dataverse to surface data in forms in another application. So we go into an app, you build an app, an archive app, and from there you can see data that is in a SQL repository. Fantastic. Okay, you have to go into a different app, but we're now paying 64 times less for that data storage. We've replicated the data. We can now see the data in an app. And now, once we're happy that we can see that data, you can now issue the bulk delete jobs within Dataverse to start removing the data and reducing storage. And we need to consider what that looks like on an ongoing basis, because if we say any data that's older than 2 years, within a week, you're going to have a fresh set of data that needs to roll into that archive. And is that a pro-code solution? Are you using functions or are you using low code like Power Automate or Logic Apps? If that is the case, there are cost implications, there are throughput limits, and it's worth considering looking at both options. Pro-code tends to be cheaper, but does require that pro-code resource. Low code a little bit more expensive, but can be managed typically easier in the business. And then a few factors to consider. We have D365 merging. If you merge records in Dynamics, the related data that may be stored within SQL won't get reassigned. So you would have to write a custom plugin for that. And then the final thing is you're changing the flow of a user, the user journey, if they need to access older data. Worth weighing up. If you're going to save £10 per month, probably not worth going to all of this effort. If you're saving hundreds or thousands, then 100% worth training users within that journey. Okay. Step number 3, another use case is around condensing data within Dataverse. So there is a Microsoft native tool, which I only found out about recently, where there is a link, and if Harry could put that in the chat, it's worth looking into later. And that allows you to compress the data at a 50% compression rate. Very easy, not much configuration, a few clicks within your admin center, and you can start to compress data. The only thing that is worth noting is that data is not retrievable. So it goes into a cold storage. If you wanted to get that back into Dataverse to be able to interact with that data as in update it, you would need to take it out and reinsert it so that it's not in that compression storage method. And then another solution that I became aware of recently is a third-party solution. It's an ISV that called Shrinky. And I mentioned earlier around activity pointers and activity storage can be very, very painful, specifically around storing of images. So if you are storing repeated embedded images, such as on the right-hand side here, here's our DQ Global logo, that image would be in every email that we send out. What Shrinky does is it takes that embedded image, removes duplication, and allows you only to store one image in file storage, and then reconstitutes that back when you're viewing it in Dynamics 365. So really a neat little tool there. The other one to look at is removing historic data, so actually moving the description, the body of the email, and moving that into file storage. Microsoft does this natively for old data, but this you can push all the way up to within a couple of hours and pushing data into colder storage. So there's a link there, Harry's put it in the chat, to take a look into that solution, where they do a free analysis as to how much you can save. Thought I'd touch on logs. Logs, $10 per month per gigabyte. $10 per gigabyte per month. And some methods around deleting storage in those log tables. So again, going into environments, auditing, and then manage within the same center that we sent in earlier. And on the left-hand side here, you can actually free up capacity by deleting audit logs. So on the left-hand side, you can select the table and select which date range you want to delete your audit logs to free up space. So that's definitely worth looking into. And then on the right-hand side, you can set a rolling deletion of how many days you want to roll out the logs. So one's about dealing with a backlog, one's about the ongoing management of audit logs. Okay. Step number 3, just wanted to take a look at a quick case study because this has a real big impact on their storage that they're paying. This is all around archiving of data, and the process that we took was very similar to what we've discussed, all about analyzing the current storage costs, building a query to understand what data can be removed from the system, which allows you to calculate your storage savings. And then once you've done that, you can understand what storage you're going to have to purchase in a lower storage method like SQL in order to add that back to the cost, as there is going to be some associated cost with that. And you can calculate your ongoing savings. It's a very simple IT business case that you can put forward to get business sign-off. And the nice thing here is the result is you can reduce the storage. You can't reduce all of your data and remove it out of Dataverse, but in this use case, reduce 50% of the storage costs with no loss of functionality because you could still access the data, and actually increase the system performance because you're storing less data within Dataverse. Okay, I can see some questions coming in, so I want to leave some time at the end, but 1 minute to look through some tips and tricks. The first thing to understand is there's a caveat around deletions of data in Dataverse, that it will increase your log storage. You issue a delete, and that will get logged in the audit log. So a little bit of a caveat there. We've already spoken about it. Deactivating records prior to deletion is a really good method that you can use to try and get sign-off. One really useful point when you're trying to virtualize data in when you're using virtual tables, they don't support polymorphic lookups. So technical folks on the call, there is a workaround for that. I'm more than happy to share that, but polymorphic lookups are not supported in virtual tables. Log storage, apply those rules so that it's ongoing. Otherwise, you're just going to build up those logs. I want to close with this tip and trick, which if you find the business really pushing back about storage costs, typically storage costs sit with the IT cost center. They're owned by the P&L for IT. If the business really needs to store that data, there could be a conversation around, well, do sales, do marketing, do other divisions start to divide up the cost in order for storing that data? One I will leave for organizations to have a think about. So just to close before we go into some questions, more than happy to speak about this on an ongoing basis. I find it fascinating. and really useful. And really, the best way to make money is to save it, so not waste it. So more than happy to have a call. Please reach out, send me an email or call. And then finally, if you want to connect there on LinkedIn, there's a link. And anyone who is potentially on the other side of the pond, anyone who's at DynamicsCon in Chicago in 2 weeks' time, I will be there and would love to meet for a drink or a beer. So thank you, everyone. I will have a look at some of the questions that have come through. Okay, so we're having issues with Copilot adding a lot of data. Not sure how to clear that out. Interesting. So Jason, again, I'd probably go back to my first question for you would be, where is it creating that data? Is it necessary? Can we look at tweaking how that data is created? And I would go from there. Sorry, is it probably one to dig into in the admin center, as I haven't seen that yet, but would love to discuss that one. SQL for CDS is an amazing tool. Agreed, John Turner. Matt, I have a question. Any advice on projecting the space that deletion will free up? Or projecting. Yes. So really got to understand when you build your data retention rules. So let's say you have 2 million rows in a table. It's taking up 2 gigabytes. If you build your criteria to say, I can get rid of 1 million rows, that's half the table. Therefore, the prediction is you can free up 1 gigabyte. So it's pretty much a one-to-one relationship. So that's how we've done it in the past, with the caveat that when you delete certain tables, it might delete in other tables like activity pointers. So there's no perfect science to it, but you can really start to predict a trend. So Helen, what would be an advantage for compression feature since the data cannot be accessed? So the benefit of the compression is that you can still read the data. So you can see it in your application, but you wouldn't be able to read it. So if you are keeping it in there for compliance reasons, the business has signed off that it has to be in Dataverse and you're not allowed to move it off to SQL, I would say you can reduce your storage costs at least by 50%, with the caveat that you won't be able to update that data necessarily. Okay, Sam Clements, nice to see you on the call. A lot of the battle is that Microsoft will add new tables, like the Copilot tables. Yeah, okay, something definitely worth discussing. They have a load of data in and have zero documentation on. We've just taken the perspective of log a ticket with Microsoft and they may be able to explain. I think it's going to be one that comes out in the wash. It's all a new space to us and it's probably a new space to Microsoft. They might not even know what tables, that those tables were being created. So yeah, an interesting one to follow. And then one from Ben, I think answering a question with Helen. Creating loads of conversation, guys, and more than happy to carry this on. A question from Jeff there. Does DQ Global have a third-party archive storage app? Do you consult on planning and implementation of data storage management? Yeah, more the latter. Less formalized application, more to do with consultation, understanding the challenges, and then building criteria, consulting, giving those facts back, and advising through the process. Really, Jeff. Turn off Copilot. Seems to be a lot of issues around Copilot, so definitely I might even follow up with a post around that if we can find anything. Okay, we are at the top of the half hour. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope you found that useful. Any questions, please reach out and we will send out a mail with a recording and any tips and tricks. But thank you everyone and hope to see you in Chicago in 2 weeks.